I'm mostly a scholar of the Revolution or of 18th century America. I'm currently writing a book on the burning of New York City on September 21st, 1776, which turns out to be a super exciting event that's kind of half military, half crowd action. I've done a couple of other books on politics in the revolutionary cities. I've looked at Boston, New York, Newport, Philadelphia, Charleston. I just get interested in the ways people get mobilized and violence and cosmopolitanism as it happens in 18th century cities. I spent a few years doing different kinds of little things for different people. So I have, there's a book called Jeffersonians in Power mostly about the Jefferson and Madison administrations. And so I have an article on the embargo of 1807 to 1809, when Jefferson tries to shut down all international trade in America. And so I talk about how Northeasterners in particular got very upset about this, and Jefferson almost divided the country sectionally far earlier than we usually talk about the sectional crisis in America. When I was an undergraduate, I was in a seminar on the social history of the American Revolution, and I was reading a famous article by Alfred F. Young on this 5'4" Boston shoemaker who was at the Boston Massacre and at the Boston Tea Party and was involved in a tarring and feathering incident. And one of the things that it talked about in that piece is that Hughes was not very politically involved prior to the Revolutionary years, and one example that the author gave was that he wasn't in a fire club. In other words, he wasn't in a volunteer firefighting company, which is how 18th century cities fought fires. And so I said, well, what did it mean during the Revolution if someone was a firefighter? And so that eventually became my senior thesis and something that I developed further into a published article. And I was really, really interested in just the interplay between fire and firefighting and politics in the 18th century cities. So that eventually led in a few different directions. One was to just think about urban politics and not think that much about fire. And then the other was to actually think about the real fires that happen, either politicized bonfires, or even burning people in effigy, or burning a ship, or trying to burn an actual city. The most interesting source that really not that many historians have used on the burning of New York City is that in October of 1783, when the war was basically all over, the British commander-in-chief at the time, Guy Carleton, commissions an investigation into the fire. So this is 7 years later. All of a sudden, they interview 40-something people about the fire. You were there. What did you see? What do you think about what happened? Tell us more about what you know. And so all these depositions survive, but they're not in any kind of official British record. These were records that were just in personal papers in New Brunswick in Canada, and then were donated to the New York Historical Society in the Upper West Side in the 19th century. So they've been lying there, and a couple of major scholars have used them for giant kind of compilation works, but nobody's really tried to interpret this source and say, does it actually reveal anything about what had happened 7 years before? And so that's the main source, but I'm also using a lot of contemporary sources, letters people wrote immediately after the fire, newspapers that were published immediately after the fire, maps, various kinds of contextual information, all sorts of other things. Well, I'm hoping it'll give us a different perspective on the Revolutionary War and its radical elements. So people didn't just burn cities. It was considered a very radical thing to do, and the British actually executed a few people on the spot. So it shows a side of the Revolutionary War that we're not used to talking about, how that war was fought and the kinds of ideas people had about what the country would look like. I would say my best teaching experience at Brooklyn College was when I taught a 4,000 level course on women in early America. And I just really felt like the discussion really gelled. We were able to talk about stuff, we didn't really cover anything that happened after the Civil War really, but we were able to really have a great interplay between contemporary issues that all of us face every day in thinking about gender and sexuality, and then also just looking at the actual history of the stuff that happened from the colonial period through the Revolution in the early 19th century. And that was a really, really great discussion. it's a really big difference coming from a place like Tufts that charges probably over $65,000 a year tuition to coming to a place like this that charges somewhere between $6,000 and $7,000 a year. So you have brilliant students and students who work just as hard at both places, but there is something of a difference. CUNY as a kind of as a bridge from the working class to the middle class for so many, that's just so exciting to be a part of. Both my parents each had 2 CUNY degrees, and so I was a believer in the CUNY mission from from the time I was very small, but I don't think I fully realized it until I had the opportunity to interact with students here, and that's been really wonderful.